Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Dan, for the introduction. So, as Dan said, I'm a Professor of Human Genetics and Embryology here at UCL in the Institute for Women's Health. And it's a really great pleasure for me to be involved in this discussion this afternoon about does egg freezing enable women to have it all? So I'd like to start with a little bit of history of IVF, because without IVF we wouldn't be having this discussion. We need IVF to generate the eggs so that we can actually freeze them. Now, IVF started back in 1978 with the birth of Louise Brown. With the birth of Louise Brown, and this was the pioneering work of Bob Edwards and Steptoe, and they worked at Bourne Hall at the University of Cambridge. And in 2010, Bob was awarded the Nobel Prize for his work in this field. And Louise Brown had her own child a few years ago, and it was in 1987, as Dan said, that I started working in IVF. And I first started off running a clinical IVF laboratory, and there I helped thousands of women get pregnant, and thousands of couples get pregnant, and it was an amazingly rewarding job. But I was busy at the time with my career and travelling the world and doing lots of other things, and time goes very rapidly. And I got to 35, and that only then met my partner, and we started trying to have children. So this is a really personal journey for me as well. So I realised quite soon that I couldn't get pregnant naturally, and embarked on 5 years of very intensive IVF treatment of my own. And here's my son here. I think my first son was born just before my 40th birthday. And then I had IVF twins a few years later who were born from frozen embryo transfer. So as you see, this is really a personal journey for me as well. Now, IVF technology has really developed since the time of Louise Brown's birth. We've got Dolly the sheep here for reproductive cloning. Next to this, we've got therapeutic cloning, which was shown in the film The Island, where you can generate a copy of yourself to generate spare parts. Hopefully that's not happening yet, but certainly could possibly happen in the future. The Handmaid's Tale looks at surrogacy. We can now use surrogacy and egg donation for homosexual couples to be able to have their own child. And Gattaca represents the work that I mainly do. I work on pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where we're testing a pre-implantation embryo on its genetic status to help couples at risk of transmitting genetic disease. But this field's being expanded at the moment, and we can now use lots of genetic tests on that one embryo. But we're here today to talk about frozen babies through frozen eggs. So let's have a little bit of biology first. Why do we need to freeze a woman's egg? Is there any need to do this procedure? Well, unfortunately, women's eggs reduce in number and quality daily. So in the uterus, we have about 7 million what we call primordial follicles, which contain an egg, something can develop into an egg. By birth, this is reduced to about 1 to 2 million. And this reduction and decrease in the quality of these potential eggs really goes down very rapidly from puberty through to the menopause. And after 35 years, we've really got a significant reduction in our fertility. And after the age of 42, it's really very difficult to get pregnant. And if anyone wants to see some data on this, you can look at the HFEA website, and they show the pregnancy rates in IVF units by ages, and you'll see that as women get older, these pregnancy and delivery rates really decline. So it's a shame that our female fertility is closely related to the age of the egg, but that is certainly the case. So we know that as the egg ages, we have a decrease in the egg quality, and we unfortunately have an increase in chromosome abnormalities. So we've got an increased risk of having a child that has a chromosome abnormality such as Down syndrome. So it is really on the age of the egg. So if we look at a 25-year-old egg donor and donate this egg to a woman in her 40s, the woman in her 40s will have the pregnancy rate of a 25-year-old. So the uterus is really quite a robust structure. Fertility is really related to the age and the quality of the egg. So really what's happened is we're now living till our 80s and 90s, and we're leading much healthier lives, but our fertility by the age of 35 starts to rapidly decrease. So evolution, in my view, has not kept up with feminism. We're under biological and social pressure to have our children young. But do we want to have our children young? Well, why are we delaying having children? Why don't we just all have our children when we're 25? Or even better, when we're 15 or 20? That's our probably most fertile time. Well, career is something that always comes up. And I've written here, why not? Why shouldn't women be allowed to have a career? My argument today would be, surely we can have all the things that men can have. And I put this argument on Facebook a few weeks ago, and I said to my friends that I was giving this talk, and a few people said, well, I don't think we can have it all, because we can't juggle these things. But I'm very much an optimist, and I think we can have it all. Why shouldn't we have a good career? In a few weeks, I have to give a talk at our local high school, and they've asked me during Science Week to give a careers talk on how a woman succeeds in a man's world. Now, I was quite shocked that they felt that teenagers need to hear this talk. But if you sit back and look at the data on this, the careers for women are not at the moment level with careers for men. So unfortunately, we have to address this. But we are changing that. Why shouldn't we change that? I think we should. People may not have found the right partner. People want to do other things. They want to travel and do lots of exciting things that we're able to do in today's society. 50 years ago, it would be very unusual for a woman to travel the world on her own. Now, you can travel with your friends or on your own, and it's quite an accepted thing to do that. And also financial. You're building your career, you may want to be in a financially secure situation, want to deliver childcare, which is very expensive, or also just to provide for your children. And if you look at the data internationally, almost all cultures now are increasing the age of first conception. So this, if you look at the data, I did a few Googles about this, you'll get amazing data where most of the women now are having their children. Certainly in the UK, the data is really amazing. We're really having our children much later than we did even 20 years ago. And what happens now is that we're delaying trying to get pregnant. So these are the patients that we often see in our IVF unit. The average age of a patient in an IVF unit is about 38 years of age. So at 38, the majority of those patients are going to be the 35 cutoff that I said earlier. So these patients are, probably most of them could have got pregnant naturally when they were in their 20s, but now they've hit 38 or more, they're finding it very hard to get pregnant naturally. For these patients, to try and stimulate an older patient to go through IVF, you've got to give increasing amounts of fertility drugs. You've got to have repeated IVF cycles to try and get pregnant. As again, you can have a look at the HFEA data on this. So it's much more costly trying to go through IVF when you're in your late 30s, early 40s, and there's a safety implication of the amount of stimulation, etc., that you need to try and achieve this. So what's the options for someone who's in their late 30s, early 40s, and they find they can't get pregnant naturally, but they can't get pregnant by IVF? Well, they could opt for egg donation, where they would not have their genetically child, they'd have a donor egg from a younger woman. They could decide that they don't have any children at all, or they could opt for adoption, which I think is probably the hardest option of that, certainly in the UK. But now we have another alternative for them. Now we have social egg freezing. So why haven't we had this before? Why are we just debating this now? Why not 10 years ago? IVF's been here since 1978. Well, the methods have only just started working. So the egg is a very big structure with a huge amount of cytoplasm with this very fragile nucleus inside, which contains half of the woman's chromosomes. And this structure has been very, very hard to freeze safely without disrupting the viability and also those chromosomes within the egg. So it was only in 1999 that a new method called vitrification was applied to a human egg, and we had the first birth following oocyte vitrification, or egg vitrification. And in 2012, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine stated that this procedure of egg freezing was no longer an experimental procedure and could now be classed as a clinical treatment. But there are some important things that we have to think about. It's not all rosy. We have to think that really you need to freeze your eggs when you're young. Freezing your eggs when you're 38 or 40 is not going to lead to good success. So most of the papers on this, and I would agree, would be that you need to freeze them under 35. You do need to go through IVF to generate these embryos. So that is a difficult procedure, as I've already outlined, but it's much easier to do when you're 25 than if you're 45. It is expensive, very expensive. So that leads to some discussions about fertility treatment for those that have money and those that don't. But this is a problem we have in the UK anyway. And freezing these eggs does not guarantee that you're going to have a child, but it is something to think about, and I think we can discuss that when we follow up after our first presentations. And when the time came that when the woman wanted to have her family, she doesn't need to use these frozen eggs. She she may decide just to reproduce naturally and hope that everything will work out, but those eggs are there for her as a backup. I would still advocate that the best chance of getting pregnant is naturally when you're young, but that's not the case for everyone. So just let's have a look at why we're freezing human eggs, just generally. A lot of work has been done on freezing these eggs for cancer patients, because when you have certain chemotherapies and radiotherapies, you knock out these eggs and you make them non-viable. So if we freeze the eggs before, it gives these patients a chance to have a child, their own biological child, when they're free from the cancer. Also the development of donor egg banks, and it overcomes some ethical and religious issues related to embryo freezing. And delayed fertility, social egg freezing, that we're discussing today. So, as Dan already mentioned, we've got companies now that are offering their staff to have their eggs frozen. And I must admit, even myself, when I first heard about the Facebook and Apple, I did cringe. I thought, oh, that's maybe, is that going too far? And I read this very good article online from Time magazine, and they mentioned that these other companies, as well as I'm sure many others, are also offering their staff to freeze their eggs for them, or some aspect of that. And the more I read about it, the more I thought about it and pondered. I thought, well, it certainly will make women much more attractive to employ. If you employ a 30-year-old or a 35-year-old who hasn't started a family, chances are as an employer that she's going to stop at some point to have a family, and that becomes very expensive. So this evens out the playing field and makes the woman not seem such a financial liability to a company. And I'm sure that, I know they're not supposed to, but I'm sure they do take this into consideration when they're employing somebody. It keeps female talent in post, so we're not restricted. We're playing on the same playing field now as any man applying for a job. And it gives women, in my view, equal rights to men. But it does, the negative side, it does give a pressurisation for women to keep working. So let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of social egg freezing. The advantages are it removes the biological clock. It gives the woman control over her own fertility in her own life. She can go travelling, she can do anything that a man can do. She's got no need to put her career on hold and no need to rush to find a partner. So this also reduces the need to go through IVF as I had to do when she's older. And it also will reduce the chance of chromosome abnormalities in her offspring because she'll freeze the eggs when she's young, when they're at lower risk of having a chromosome abnormality. There are disadvantages. There's the cost. The IVF, having to go through IVF is very, very difficult. It's very stressful, very emotional procedure to go through. It might not work. They might come to use those eggs when they're 40 and find that they don't get pregnant. That is something they have to be aware of. There may be pressure, as I said, from the companies to keep working. And there are risks to older women that achieve a pregnancy. In the UK, the regulations for use of egg donors is that you have to be under 50. And the same should be set for so people that have frozen their eggs, they'd have to use these frozen eggs before they're 50. So, just to finish off, does egg freezing enable women to have it all? Well, I've said there, yes. I would still encourage women to have children young. I think we need to provide good childcare, we need workplaces to be flexible. Even if they offer social egg freezing, they should also offer excellent childcare facilities. So now we've got an informed choice. We've got two options. We can have our children young, naturally, or we could freeze our eggs and delay this for when we feel ready to do it. So we now have a viable reproductive option with egg freezing. And I certainly would have done it at 25. If I was 25 now, me personally, I would have frozen my eggs. So I didn't have to go through those 5 years of fertility treatment that I did. And the last slide, just to point out these two papers. Francois Shenfield's here in the audience. She's one of the authors of the first paper from the ESHRE Task Force on Law and Ethics. And this excellent paper can be freely downloadable from the ESHRE website. And this other paper as well looks at some of the views of women thinking about going through this procedure. Thank you.